me the story of Jesus, right from my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read while you whisper, love in the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
We're going to continue. In fact, we should conclude our study this morning on the history of the true Church of Jesus Christ, giving you the characteristics of what you should look for to find the true church. That's really what we've been doing. What we were setting the groundwork last week, covered quite a bit of ground last week on certain things that you want to look for to find the true church. Remember, there was a promise by Christ that upon this rock will I build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. We were shown in Daniel, in the prophecy of Daniel, that when the kingdom was set up, which is the local church, that it would be here forever, that it would not fail, that it would always be here. So to find a church that has been here throughout all ages, that is never apostatized, should be the goal of anyone that's trying to find God, that's trying to seek God. He said that his church would be here. So if we're going to find it, we need to know what the characteristics of it are. What does it look like? When I bump into this thing, how am I going to know this is it? So that's what we're dealing with. We showed that the church would be preserved throughout all time. We showed that the office of the elder and the ordinance of baptism are the means that God uses to build his church. All right, remember that. Baptism is extremely important in building the church and the office of the elder. We showed that those offices and that ordinance will also be preserved throughout all time. That they will continue in an unbroken sense. In other words, there's never been, nor shall there be any time in history when the church ceases to exist, and therefore the office of the elder and the ordinance of baptism will continue throughout all time. And we're told over in 1 Corinthians that the ordinance of the Lord's Supper will continue until Christ returns. We also looked at the fact that the church will be persecuted. It's one of the things that I made mention of last week, that I never could really get my head around that one, because here I was in what I thought was a true church. Nobody ever persecuted me. I got along fine with everybody, world and church and everybody. So that never made sense to me. And then I joined this church, and different story. So the church will be persecuted. You can expect that. And so when you're looking in history, you should be looking for a church that was persecuted. Not one that was held up in high esteem by mankind, but one that has been persecuted. Also, that it will be greatly opposed by Rome. Not so much the city of Rome as well. Empirical Rome and ecclesiastical Rome, both of them, will oppose the true church and have done forever. And so we looked at that. So remember that the true church and Rome are two opposing ideas. They have been all the way down through history. So don't look for the true church to come out of Rome. Now, there was a true church in Rome, and we have an epistle in here that Paul wrote to it. But after a period of time, it fell apart and turned into what we now call the Roman Catholic Church. But that does not mean that the true church came out of Rome. There comes a point in time that we're told over in the book of Revelation that there comes a point in time when God will pull the candlestick from a church, and at that point it ceases to be a true church. Once it goes too far, he'll yank the candlestick and it's no longer a true church anymore. And we'll get to how Rome came about in a few minutes. I made the point last week that the Protestant Reformation was a reformation of Catholicism. It was not a reformation of Christianity. They were not reforming the true church. They were trying to get back to the ancient Catholic doctrine. And I have more to say about that today as well. The next thing I want to look at, though, and this is very important, I want you to turn to Acts chapter 24. Because there's a couple of points about the true church that we're going to find that might sound odd to you, might be a little bit different than what you might expect, but it might actually be what you've experientially experienced. That was a hard one to say, and it doesn't even make sense. You may have experienced some of this, and yet you probably didn't expect it. Okay? In Acts chapter 24 and verse 5, we're talking about the Apostle Paul when they had grabbed him. The Jews had grabbed him, and they're making their case against Paul. And they say, "For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." A sect. Expect to be called a sect. Now, if you don't know what a sect is, I'll tell you. The dictionary defines a sect as a religious group or faction, a religious group or faction regarded as heretical or as deviating from Orthodox tradition. The Apostle Paul, the Jews thought, was a heretic, that he was a member of a sect. Expect the same. Don't expect anything other than what the Apostle Paul got. If somebody says, "Oh, you're a member of a sect," don't be surprised. And if you're looking through history trying to find the true church, understand that it's just like, the old saying, to the victor go the spoils. The people that win get to write the history books. If someone comes along and destroys an entire church, burns them and all of their records, they get to tell the story. They're the ones that get to write the history. So expect that in Roman Catholic histories, you're going to find these people called sects and heretics and other bad things. Expect that, because they're the ones that are going to write the history. Okay? In Acts chapter 28 and verse 22, this is when Paul was going to trial, and it says, "But we desire to hear of thee what thou thinkest, for as concerning this sect, we know that everywhere it's spoken against." You see, the thing that Paul was talking about, people didn't like it. The world didn't care too much for the church that Paul was setting up in the world. It was different. It didn't go hand in hand with accepted traditions. If there was something different about it, they called it a sect. In Acts chapter 24 and verse 14, we have something else that we find. It says, but this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy." Now that word that's translated heresy there is the same word translated sect in verse 5. And that we looked at just a second ago in Acts 28. "The way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets." The word heresy is a belief or opinion contrary to orthodox religious doctrine, opinion profoundly at odds with what is generally accepted. Well, are we at odds with what's generally accepted when it comes to Christianity? Yeah, we are. We believe that eternal salvation is by the grace of God and by the faith of Jesus Christ. That's at odds with most of Christianity, which teaches that eternal salvation is based on works. So we're at odds with that. So expect people to think that you're some sort of a sect. And when you find this down through history, expect to find writing about these different groups as being heretical, as being sects, and such like. I want you to look at something here quickly. In Mark chapter 14, I'm going to kind of go backwards from my outline here for a second, but Mark chapter 14, verse 64. This is when Christ is speaking at his trial before the high priest and before the Sanhedrin. And in verse 64 it says, "Ye have heard the blasphemy, what think ye?" And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. What did he do? What did he do? He claimed to be the Son of God. For that, he was nailed to a cross. Okay? Now I want you to look at something else. Look at Luke chapter 23. I'll tie this up in just a second. Luke chapter 23. Verses 1 through 5. "And the whole multitude of them arose and led unto Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king. And Pilate asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Thou sayest it. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. And they that were the more fierce, saying, He stirreth up all the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place." You see, he's stirring up the people. He's against the people. He does things against the people. He's against the common religion. He's a blasphemer. Okay? These are some of the things that they spoke about Jesus Christ. These are some of the words that were spoken about him. Now I want you to go back to Acts chapter 21, and I want you to see that exactly the same things are said about Paul. And if they were said about Paul, you can expect them to be said about you as well, and about every other member of a true church all the way down through history. Acts chapter 21, verse 28. "Crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place, and further brought Greeks also into this temple, and hath polluted this holy place." None of which Paul ever did, but they made up false charges against him and told him he was against the people. Expect that to happen. If you're in the true church, you may run into this. You may run into people that say, well, you're contrary to what the church teaches. You're against the people. That's what they said about Jesus, and that's what they said about Paul. And that's what they've said about the true church all the way down through history, as we're going to see in a few minutes. This is one of the reasons that we read over in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 13. "But rejoice inasmuch as ye are partaker of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy." You see, some of the sufferings that Christ went through, we're going to go through in this world as a result of being associated with his church. People are going to say the same things about you that they said about him. And that's when we're told to pick up our cross and carry it. Because remember, our sufferings down here, no matter how bad they may be, are only going to last for a very short period of time. Compared to eternity, like Ken Hovind used to say, you're going to be dead a lot longer than you were alive. So look forward to what you've got on the other end. It's also a fact that it was the persecutions that Christ endured and the suffering that he went through that proved that he was a Christ. When you go back, that was the argument that they made over and over and over again in the book of Acts. That was it not that Christ was supposed to suffer and die and then rise again from the dead? You look at the prophecies in the Old Testament, that's what it kept talking about. This is one of the proofs. One of the proofs of the true church is that it's going to be persecuted. And people are going to call the members heretics. Now, we live in a time, and we'll get to this a little bit later on too, but we live in a time when it's been relatively peaceful for the last couple of hundred years. And there's a reason for that, and I intend to get to that this morning. But see, the nation that we live in refused to set up a state church. That was one thing that the founding fathers did that was extremely wise, and as a result, we're able to live in relative peace. Because anywhere in the past where a state church was set up, anyone that went contrary to that state church was persecuted. You know, you look at the history, you find that the Baptists helped John Calvin, and once John Calvin got the Presbyterian church set up and it became the Church of Scotland, what's the first thing they did? They ran the Baptists out. Started persecuting the Baptists. So anytime there's a state church set up, it's going to persecute the true church. It's just going to happen. So it was very wise that they did what they did, and as a result, we haven't had to witness a lot of the things that our religious ancestors have had to witness. We've had a relative couple of 100-year period of time here where it's been relatively peaceful. Doesn't mean it's going to stay that way forever, but at least for a little while, it's been a little easier on us than it has been on many of the others. I want you to turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, just to make the point that the church is identified by some of the persecutions that they endure. It's expected that churches will be persecuted. This is something you have to plan on. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. For ye, brethren, became followers of the churches of God, which in Judea are in Christ Jesus. For ye also have suffered like things of your own countrymen, even as they have of the Jews. You see, the people in Thessalonica had suffered persecution by the Gentiles, just like the church in Jerusalem had suffered persecution by the Jews, no difference, who both killed the Lord Jesus and their own prophets, and have persecuted us, and they please not God and are contrary to all men. Expect that. Expect not to be accepted as well as you were before you joined the church. The minute you come up out of the water, expect that things are going to change. And people that don't even know you are going to look at you a little bit differently than they did before. That's normal, and that's the way the church seems to work. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 10 says, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Peter said in one place that if you're, maybe I need to find it because I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he was talking about, you know, if you're persecuted as a murderer or something, well, that doesn't buy anything. But if you're being persecuted as a child of God, if you're persecuted for that, well, then you should be glad, because they persecuted Christ the same way. So I mean, if you're thrown in jail because you're a Christian, we'll be happy for it. But if you're thrown in jail because of some other reason, well, you're a criminal and you deserve it. If I commit murder and I'm thrown in jail, I can't then say, well, they're persecuting me because I'm a preacher. No, they threw you in jail because you're a murderer. Different story, okay? Now, let's expect down through history that the churches that oppose Rome, and when I mention Rome, I'm talking about Roman Catholicism, that the churches that oppose Rome are going to be maligned as sectarian, heretical, and radical. Expect to see that. When you read the church history by Schaff, which is a pro-Roman Catholic position, or you read any of the histories written by the Catholic Church Fathers, expect to see things in here about these groups that are going to malign them and call them heretical and sectarian and so forth. Expect that. Because again, if they win, they get to write the history. So expect to see those types of things, and expect Rome to lie about those that opposed her. Why wouldn't she? Never stopped her before on anything else. I mean, think about this organization, the Roman Catholic Church. Look at the abominations that thing has dealt with down through the centuries. I think I might have mentioned this last week, that in some of the places around the old convents where they've dredged up lakes and found hundreds of thousands of baby skeletons because they didn't have abortion at the time, and priests and nuns have to be celibate, right? Or at least put on that they are. You know, there was a thing that they called the Inquisition. You've probably heard of the Inquisition, when they would go out and find what they considered to be heretics and torture them. Do you realize that as early ago as in the late 1800s, that was still going on? When Constantine Tischendorf went to the Pope to get his permission, and I don't know why he went to the Pope to get permission from a Pope, being a so-called Protestant theologian. I don't know why he went to the Pope to get permission, but he did. To get permission from the Pope to go to St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai to find what they call the Septuagint, or whatever that thing is. At the time he was there, at the time he was kissing Pope Gregory's ring to get permission to do that, the Inquisition was going on right below them in the basement. Charles Spurgeon even wrote about the fact that it was going on. And they discovered in the catacombs that they were still murdering Protestants as early as the late 1800s. And they may be doing it now, for all I know. I wouldn't put it past them. So when you read historical accounts, you have to read between the lines. You have to be able to look at some of these things and know what they're going to say about them. Then when you find out what they say about them and do a little bit more research, you might find out that what they're saying about them is, you might have found a true church. If they're throwing rocks at somebody, it may very well be a true church that you're looking at right there, once you do a little bit more research. I want you to also expect something else. I made this statement last week, but let me make it again. Down through history, when you're looking for an unbroken line of true churches, you have to expect that not all of them are going to be 1,000% accurate. Expect to see some error. Expect to see that there's going to be a problem here or there with these churches. That very few of the church, for one thing, it's very hard to find all of the records because they destroyed most of them. But you have to look for the major traits to see whether or not this was a Baptistic type of a church or not. You're not going to find all their doctrine, and you better expect that even if you do, you're probably going to find a problem here or there. Okay? In Acts chapter 20, verse 29, it says, "For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them." You see, expect that people are going to slip into the church and start to bring error into these churches. All you have to do is read 1 Corinthians, read Revelations, Galatians, read the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3, and you will see some of the errors that they were dealing with. So don't expect to see an absolute perfect error-free church coming down through history. Look for the major points that are required in order for it to be a true church. And then don't worry about some of the errors. Does that make sense? A true church there's a couple of points that it has to be if it's going to be a true church. It has to be a congregation of persons that have been properly baptized in water upon a profession and confession of faith in Jesus Christ as the virgin-born Son of God, God manifest in the flesh, who died, was buried, and rose again according to the Scripture for the salvation of sinners. That's what's required to find a true church. Now notice, there's a lot in that. They have to be baptized after a profession of faith. How many infants can make a profession of faith? None. You see, these are characteristics of a Baptist church. A Baptist church, you make a profession of faith in Christ and then you're baptized. Okay, so expect to find that down through history. That's one of the keys that you're looking for. And this confession of faith is what is the essence of the gospel. I want you to turn to Acts chapter 8, where we have the case of the Ethiopian eunuch. Philip comes upon the Ethiopian eunuch, and the eunuch is sitting there reading out of the book of Isaiah, and Philip asks him, well, do you understand what you're reading? And he basically says, well, no. And how could I if nobody's going to tell me? So Philip explains it to him, and he says here in verse, verse 35, then Philip opened his mouth and began at the same scripture and preached unto him Jesus. And as they went on their way, they came unto a certain water, and the eunuch said, see, here is water. What doth hinder me to be baptized? Now, this is interesting. We went over this once before. In the new Bibles, the next verse is missing. They sliced it out. You look at the NIV, this next verse isn't even going to be there. They got rid of it. The explanation of what doth hinder me to be baptized is taken out of all the new Bibles. But it's still here in the King James. And Philip said, if thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And then Philip commanded the chariot to be still, and they went down and he baptized him in the water. You see, that profession of faith has to be made first. You have to profess that you believe first. Infants can't profess that they believe anything. So infant baptism is nothing. Okay? So understand, that's something that we should be looking for. Turn also to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 4. Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which I preached unto you, which also ye have received, and wherein ye stand, by which also ye are saved, if ye keep in memory what I preached unto you, unless you have believed in vain. For I delivered unto you first of all that which also I received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. That's the gospel. And if you believe that, and if you make a profession that you believe that, then we baptize you in water, and you become a member of the church. But that's one of the essences of what we look for, and this is a distinguishing characteristic of Baptist churches. You don't find this in a lot of you don't find this in the Catholics. You don't find it among Presbyterians or Lutherans or Methodists or any of those people. All the people that baptize babies, they don't follow this rule. This is a Baptist rule. Now, there are a couple other churches that have broken away from Baptists that do this. The Campbellites, or the Church of Christ, I think it is. They require you to make a profession of faith in Christ, and then they baptize you. But they've gone so far as to believe that you have to be baptized to go to heaven. So they've adopted baptismal regeneration along with a whole bunch of other stuff. But this is a characteristic of a Baptist church. So this is something that we want to look for. Now, I'm going to give you a brief history, a brief sketch of the history of the true church. Starting, well, we know the first century we had the apostles. So that's, the churches were there. They wrote to them. You have a Bible that's got letters to a whole bunch of those churches. But what happened to them after that? Where'd they go after that? What do we find? If we look at history, what do we find after the first century? Remember, the Roman Catholic Church wasn't established until 325 AD, which is the 4th century. So what have we got between the 1st century and coming down through the line. There had to be churches out there, right? In the 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries, there had to be churches, because how else could there have even been a Roman Catholic Church? If there wasn't something out there, where were they? Who were they? How do we find them? Okay? The first thing we're going to look at, the first group we're going to look at are called the Monatists. Turn to Acts chapter 18. The Monatists are one of those groups that are recognized in history, and we're going to read a little bit about them from a couple of sources. And they were prominent in Phrygia, in a country called Phrygia. Okay? In Acts chapter 18 and verse 23, we read, and after that, and after he had spent some time there, we're talking about the Apostle Paul. After he had spent some time there, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia, in order, strengthening all the disciples. The Apostle Paul was in Phrygia, and we find in the 2nd century a group of people called the Monatists in Phrygia. I want you to also turn, if you have a paper Bible, I want you to turn to, I think is it 2 Timothy? 1 Timothy. I don't know if they have the subscription on electronic Bibles or not, but if you have a paper one, down at the, and what I mean by the subscription is at the end of chapter 6, verse 21, in a paper Bible, there's probably some writing in very, very small print. And it says this: the first to Timothy was written from Laodicea, which is the chiefest city of Phrygia. The letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy, the first epistle that he wrote from Phrygia. So we have a connection between the Apostle Paul and this country called Phrygia. Now, we don't have an epistle that he wrote to a church in Phrygia, but you can almost draw a conclusion that if he was there and he was writing an epistle to Timothy, there were probably disciples in Phrygia. You could come to that conclusion. And then we stump up against this group called the Monatists. And we find them down in history between the 2nd and the 6th centuries. For that entire 4 centuries, we find these Monatists, this group called the Monatists. They reacted against secularism in the church. They rejected infant baptism. They did something else. Now this is, I'm going to read from the Catholic Reference Encyclopedia. Okay? This is not a Baptist book. This is the Catholic. Remember, I told you, expect to see certain things written in a history by those that were opposed to the group. Okay? Under Monatists, it says 2nd century schismatics, named Fermontius, a Phrygian who claimed to be a prophet inspired by the Holy Spirit, maintaining that he had received new revelations. We don't know if that's true or not. Monatists demanded a rigorous, asectarian, and renewed fervor in preparation for the second coming of Christ, which he held was near at hand. The Monatists, now watch this, rejected the power of the church to forgive sins. Rejected the power of the church? The church has the power to forgive sins? Since when does a church have the power to forgive sins? You know, I read over in Mark chapter 2 something. In fact, I read it in a bunch of places, but Mark chapter 2, there was a time when Christ forgave sins, and the Jews didn't like it very much. Mark chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. But there were certain of the scribes sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, Why doth this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? Only God can forgive sins. Now the point here in the Bible is that Jesus Christ was God manifest in the flesh. That's how he had the authority to forgive sins. Since when does the Catholic Church have the authority to forgive sins? And yet that's one of the charges against the Monatists, because they rejected the power of the Church to forgive sins. A doctrine which may have won Tertullian to their side, and then it goes on and on from there. But that's one of the points that they make about the Monatists. See? Expect this. This is what you should expect when you come down to look at these groups. And you notice that, okay, they rejected infant baptism. They didn't accept the Church's position on forgiving sins. And the Catholics themselves say they were here in the 2nd century. Even their enemies acknowledge the fact that they were there. So we find this group called the Monatists between the 2nd and the 6th centuries. Okay? We then have a group called the Novatianists. These are found in the 3rd to the 5th century. Novatian opposed the election of Cornelius as bishop of the Church of Rome because Cornelius favored readmitting into the church those who had lapsed into idol worship during the Decian persecution. So here were people that dropped back out of the church, started worshiping idols again, and this guy didn't want to let them back in the church. And for that reason, they were accused by the Catholics of not being fair. Novatian is reputed to have been a native of, guess where? Phrygia. He was from Phrygia, where the Monatists were. I wonder if there's a connection there. One of the things that they were accused of doing were rebaptizing converts from the Catholic point of view. They wouldn't accept the baptism of the Catholic Church. Why would that be? Maybe because an infant can't make a profession in faith? Now, our same Catholic encyclopedia, Novatianism, the schism and heresy of Novatian, who in the 3rd century denied the Church's power to absolve from the sin of idolatry. The Church's power to absolve, again, the Church has the power to absolve from the sin of idolatry. The Church can do it? When did God give the Church the right to do that? But he was called a heretic because he didn't recognize the Church's power to absolve from the sin of idolatry, and set himself up as an anti-pope in opposition to Pope Saint Cornelius. In other words, he set himself up to be exactly what Elder Mott, Elder Gerald, myself, and other Baptist ministers have set themselves up to be. That we answer to God. We don't have a hierarchy. We answer directly to God on your behalf. That's what he set himself up to be. His followers maintain that other sins, example, murder, adultery, fornication, were in the same category as idolatry and could not be absolved. In other words, there's not different levels of different types of, you don't have some sins that are tougher than others that you have to do more penance for or whatever. So, you see, that's what the Catholics have to say about these guys. And they ran from the 3rd to the 5th century. We then find the Donatists from the 4th to the 7th century. They had the same doctrinal roots as the Novatians. Donatists opposed the election of one of the guys, a bishop of Carthage, because he'd been ordained by Felix, who was guilty of delivering up copies of the scriptures during that same Decian persecution, and they were opposed by the Catholics. Big shock there. And they insisted that the church is a society of holy persons. that you actually have to try to live a godly life if you're going to be in the church. What a horrible thing to come up with. But for that reason, they were opposed by Catholicism. Now, this is a Baptist history book, Compendium of Baptist History by Shackelford. If you're looking for a good, easy read history book, this is a good one to get if you can find it. On page 52 through 53, AD 415. At this Catholic council in the year 415, the following declaration was made. We will that whoever denies that little children by baptism are freed from perdition and eternally saved, that they be accursed. That's the Catholic position. Okay? Had the Catholics been able to produce scriptural evidence in support of infant baptism, their bitter denunciations would not have been needed. All these people, known by the names of Monatists, Novatians, and Donatists, were distinguished by the following characteristics which marked them as Baptists. Now this is what the Catholics found these people to be guilty of. Okay? First, their churches were local, independent bodies. Sound familiar? This is a local, independent body. Second, the terms bishop and pastor signified with them the same office, and they were the servants of the churches. Sound familiar? You know what? You could be a Monatist, or a Novatian, or a Donatist. Third, they admitted none to their membership but baptized believers. Fourth, they invariably baptized by immersion. Fifth, they opposed the doctrine of baptismal salvation. Orchard says of these people, the Novatians and Donatists very nearly resemble each other in doctrine and discipline. Indeed, they are charged by Crispin, a French historian, with holding together in the following things. First, for purity of church members by asserting that none ought to be admitted into the church but such as were visibly true believers and real saints. Secondly, for purity of church discipline. Thirdly, for the independency of each church. And fourthly, they baptized again those whose first baptism they had reason to doubt. They were consequently termed rebaptizers or Anabaptists. That's who the Monatists and the Novatians and the Donatists were. Now, they were called heretics, and they were called a sect by the Catholics, but that's who they were. They weren't any different than we are. Not in the main ideas. I mean, if you lived in the 2nd century, you could probably go find yourself a Monatist church and feel right at home with them. Okay? Well, that takes us all the way to the 7th century. It's into the 600s. Then we find a group in the 5th century. They pop up in the 5th century. And they lasted all the way through the Crusades, which ended in the 1300s. And they were known as the Paulicians. This is Elder Mott's favorite group because they were called Paulician. Most of these groups were called, they were labeled by the name of the leader. Like we might be called Geraldites or Mottites or something like that, or Boffyists or something. I don't know. But in this case, they were called Paulicians because they adhered so tenaciously to the doctrines of the Apostle Paul that they called them Paulicians. One of their crimes was that they allegorized the Eucharist, denying that the bread and wine should be offered as a sacrifice. You see, when they took communion, it wasn't a sacrifice. They were looking at it from the standpoint that it was done in remembrance of Christ. It wasn't, they allegorized it. It was it was a sign. It wasn't a new, fresh sacrifice. Well, that was grounds to be murdered by the Roman Catholic Church. If you didn't acknowledge that the Eucharist was a sacrifice, they'd cut your head off. That was a crime. If they found you and you refused to take the Eucharist, claiming that that's what it was, well, you're a heretic. So we'll kill you in this life, and then we'll pray that you're killed in the next. So they allegorized the Eucharist. They opposed cross worship. And they denied that baptism had the character of a sacrament. They went so far as to call Catholic baptism bathwater. You don't get born again by coming up out of the water. These people spread all over Asia Minor and Armenia into Bulgaria. And we read here, these Paulicians were at once distinguished for their zeal, piety, and the austerity of their lives. The simplicity of their doctrines commended them to the common people, and consequently, in little time, says Orchard, congregations were gathered in the provinces of Asia Minor to the westward of the river of the Euphrates. Their opinions were also silently propagated in Rome, Milan, and in the kingdom beyond the Alps, referring to France. You see, they kind of had to keep it quiet in Rome. Weren't quite as out public in Rome as they were in other areas. The same writer says the whole body of Christians in Armenia came over to the Paulicians and embraced their views. Their churches were modeled as nearly after the New Testament churches as it was possible, and even named for them in many instances. It's recorded that 6 of them were named from those to whom the Apostle Paul addressed his epistles: Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, and Thessalonica. The Paulician teachers were distinguished only by their scriptural titles. The Paulicians were sometimes denominated, and it's got I can't pronounce that word, or headless, from the fact that they're having no bishop in the Roman sense of the term. So again, we have an independent church that doesn't have a hierarchy. Independent church where the pastor of the church answers directly to Christ. Same thing. That's a charge. That's a charge that they would put you to death for, because you didn't answer to the Pope. Alarmed at the rapid growth of the Paulicians, the Catholic party, true to the principles of their faith, begun to inflict upon them the most severe persecutions. And then I won't bother to read the rest of that. But these were the Paulicians, and we find them all the way down to the 1300s. You find these groups. Now, we've gone from the 2nd century, right, 100 AD, all the way to 1300 AD, and we've found groups that never had anything at all to do with the Roman Catholic Church, scattered out throughout the empire. Independent bodies that believed much the same that we believe. There's a 10th century polemic which is found written against a group called the Bogomils. And this was a sect that was found in Bulgaria where the Paulicians had spread. They popped up around where the Paulicians had been. They denied the validity of sacraments. They repudiated infant baptism, and their influence extended into Italy. The Bogomils, that's another group. We then have a group called the Albigenses. And we find these guys all over the place. The Albigenses, we find them in the 12th and the 13th centuries. They were also known as Cathari, which means Puritans. They rejected infant baptism. They denied transubstantiation, the idea that the bread and wine turn into the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ when the priest says whatever, hominy domini, asbestos post toasties hum, or whatever it is that he says when he holds up the wafer. They maintained a relationship with Bogomils. They denied that the Church of Rome was the true church. They maintained that the true church teaches first, whereas the Roman church baptizes first. On page 80 of the Compendium of Baptist History, it says, Albigenses, in the year 1019, we find the Catholics inflicting their accustomed persecutions upon the Albigenses in France. The Catholic idea of salvation by works was so completely rooted and grounded in the people of that faith that no effort was made to propagate their doctrines except by compulsion. Force you into it. We don't have to teach you, we'll just force you into it. The idea had become universal among them that out of their church was no salvation, and that the end justified the use of any means, however so wicked, which might be used to compel submission to their faith. With the Catholic, out of the church was death, within it was life, and in its maddening thirst for power, the Catholic party sought to crush everything beneath its feet which could not gather within its folds. These were the Dark Ages, folks. These were bad times. And so what they would do is if they found a group like us, well, then they would just murder all of us and burn all of our records. And then brand us as heretics and write the history that we were heretics. That's what they've done that's what the Catholics have done all the way down through history. So these Albigenses, we found them in, I think it was the 10th century. Then the Preto-Brutians and the Henrietians are found in the 12th century. Peter de Bruce was a priest who became a reformer in 1100. His successor was Henry of Lausanne, a former Benedictine monk. These guys came under conviction that what was going on was wrong, and they did what Luther and Calvin should have done. They renounced the Catholic Church altogether and became Baptists. They went and got baptized and became Baptist ministers. That's what Luther and Calvin should have done. It's not what they did. They just simply tried to reform the Catholic Church, but they never quit being Catholic priests. And their doctrine proves it. Look at the doctrine of the Lutheran Church. Look at the doctrine of the Presbyterian Church. For the most part, doctrinally, they're pretty close to the same. They both teach that you're saved by works. They both baptize babies. They both have some form of, well, it's not called transubstantiation in their churches. They still have the same kind of thing with the Eucharist. It's just as important to them as it is to the Roman Catholics. They wear the same funny clown costumes. They do all the same stuff that the Catholics do. Well, maybe they don't wear the fish hat, but they get pretty close to it. The Preto-Brutians believed that persons should not be baptized before reaching the years of distinction. In other words, they repudiated the idea of infant baptism. And they deemed crucifixes to be instruments of superstition. This one guy, he took a bunch of crucifixes and he burned them. So in retaliation, Rome burned him at the stake. Since he burned crucifixes, they burned him. And they denied transubstantiation. Let's see what we have in here on them. AD 1135, within 5 years after the martyrdom of Peter de Bruce, Henry of Lausanne, a city in Switzerland, appeared as a reformer. He'd been a monk and a hermit, but when the light of divine truth broke upon his mind, he quit the monastery and hermitage and entered the ministry. He met with a success similar to that which attended the ministry of de Bruce. He declaimed with great fervor against the vices of the Roman clergy and the superstitions of that church. The effect of his ministry is better seen by quoting from Bernard, a Catholic who, writing to the Council of St. Giles, says, "How great are the evils which we have heard and known to be done by Henry the heretic. And what he is still every day doing in the churches of God, he wanders up and down in your country in sheep clothing, being a ravenous wolf, but according to the hint given by our Lord, we know him by his fruits." You see, that's the way that they would ban someone like us, someone like me, a wolf in sheep's clothing, because I stand up against the Roman Catholic Church. We then have a group called the Waldensians. These guys come all the way down from the 12th century, we find them all the way until the 19th century. The 19th century is the 1800s. We find these Waldensians all the way down to the 1800s. They derive their name from the valleys of Piedmont called the Vaux, hence their name is actually Vaudus or Waldensians, but we end up pronouncing it with a W. They claim that the Church of Rome was the whore of Babylon. Have you heard that before? They claimed apostolic authority, in other words, that they were the succession from the apostles, that the apostles laid hand on Timothy, and Timothy laid hands on someone else, and so on, all the way down to them. That's what they mean when they say they claimed apostolic authority. Scattered bodies of them were found in Germany, Poland, Bohemia, and Austria. It says here, history tells us that in the Dark Ages, the Waldenses spread themselves all over Europe, but were everywhere treated as the filth of the world and the offscourging of all things. Each succeeding generation seemed to increase in hatred towards these unfortunate people and gave vent to its pent-up fury with increased energy. I mean, they were just persecuted like you wouldn't believe, but they just kept growing. And we find them all the way down to the 19th century. Anabaptists and Mennonites are found from the 16th century forward. Anabaptist, it means somebody that rebaptizes someone that was baptized before. We follow that principle here. If someone came to this church and they were baptized as an infant, as a Catholic, we don't accept that baptism. If somebody comes in here and they were baptized into some church that we don't consider to be of the true lineage of the church, we're going to dunk in the water again. It's that simple. We're Anabaptists. We're rebaptizers. Mennonites came out of the Anabaptists, and we find these from the 16th century, and they're easy to find. By that time, it's easy to find them. Mennonites are so named from the Anabaptist Minnow Simmons. They became prominent in Germany, where the Waldensians were found. How about that? You see how this trail just keeps bumping into each other? You've got these different groups that are here, and then all of a sudden another group has connections with them, and you follow these all the way down through history. Now we're all the way down to the 16th century. Frequent references is made to them in English history during the 15th and the 16th century. They denied the validity of infant baptism. They were punished with death by drowning. The old saying that he who dips shall be dipped. And so they would tie rocks around you and throw you in the water and let you drown. You want to be dipped, you can die that way. That was the favorite way of the Catholics to kill these guys off. There was a Lutheran historian, Mosheim, who acknowledged that the origin of this sect, there's that word again, is hidden in the remote depths of antiquity. Get on another book here. On the 22nd day of August, 1572, commenced this diabolical act of singular brutality, I'm going to say. It was intended to destroy at one stroke the root of the Protestant tree, which had only before partially suffered in its branches. The King of France had artfully proposed a marriage between his sister and the Prince of Navarre, the captain and prince of the Protestants. Now they're calling them Protestants. They weren't Protestants, they were Baptists. They went under the name of Huguenots at this time. Okay? This impudent marriage was publicly celebrated at Paris, August 18th, by the Cardinal of Bourbon upon a high stage erected for the purpose. They dined in great pomp with the bishop and supped with the king at Paris. 4 days after this, the prince, as he was coming from the council, was shot in both arms. He then said to his friend, his deceased mother's minister, O my brother, I now do perceive that I am indeed beloved of my God, since for his most holy sake I am wounded. Although the Vidam advised him to fly, yet he abode at Paris and was soon after slain by Bimjus, who afterward declared he never saw a man meet death more valiantly than the admiral. The soldiers were appointed at certain signal to burst out instantly to the slaughter in all parts of the city. When they had killed the admiral, they threw him out of a window into the street, where his head was cut off and sent to the Pope. The savage papists, still raging against him, cut off his arms and private members, and after dragging him 3 days through the streets, hung him up by the heels without the city. This is the guy that the king invited to marry his daughter, because he was a Huguenot. He wasn't a Catholic. After him, they slew many great and honorable persons who were Protestants, and he goes through a big old list, and I could read this on and on and on and on. It became known as the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre at Paris. You might want to go take a look at it in a history book and read about this. This was a time when the Catholic Church, the de Medici family actually, launched this war against the Huguenots. The Huguenots were Waldensians. They were Baptists. Interestingly enough, this is one of the I believe this is one of the reasons that the United States of America would not allow this country to have a state church. This was still fairly fresh on the minds of our founding fathers, as fresh as the Revolutionary War is to you, or the Civil War. It wasn't that long ago. If you travel no more than 3 hours from here, you will find a little place called St. Augustine, Florida. In St. Augustine, Florida, you will find, now that's the oldest city in America, dates back into the 1500s. Same time period as this, what I just read you. And guess what you're going to find there? Separate from everyone else, there is a Huguenot cemetery. These people were not just slaughtered in France. They were slaughtered everywhere they could be found. And they were the state church. So you see, that's one of the reasons that our founding fathers didn't allow a state church to be set up here. Now, I will go so far as to say that we do have a state religion. They don't call it religion, they call it science. It's the theory of evolution. That is the state religion of the United States of America. And it's indoctrinated into all of our children in public schools, and it's taught in all of our universities. And the reason they don't agree that it's a religion is because we have this little document called a Constitution that says we're not going to set up a state religion. So therefore, we can't call it religion, we'll call it science. But it's really our state religion, because it can't be proven. None of it can be substantiated from anything other than a theory. But that is primarily the reason that we don't have a state religion here other than that. If we ever got one, then we could expect to have to go hide somewhere again, like our religious ancestors have done for centuries, from the 1st century all the way down. So after this group, we have Baptists. Now, the Baptists are easily found. You can find Baptists from the 17th century on to the present anywhere you look. There are basically 2 sets of Baptists, however. There are some Baptists that believe that they are nothing more than another Protestant denomination. They believe that they were started by a guy, I think his name was Roger Williams, who baptized himself and then baptized a bunch of other people. He'd been a Presbyterian and decided to become a Baptist, and he couldn't find a Baptist preacher, so he just went ahead and baptized himself and claimed and ordained himself, and then baptized a bunch of other people, and from that started a whole bunch of different churches out there that are called Baptist. The Reverend Jesse Jackson would fall into that category, and a whole bunch of other guys that call themselves Baptist would, and if you were to ask them, they'd say, yeah, we're Protestants. But then there's another side, and that's what we are. And these are Baptists that are not Protestants. A Protestant is someone that protested against the Roman Catholic Church and came out of her because they believed that she apostatized. We never did that. We never acknowledged the Roman Catholic Church to be anything but a whore. She's always been a whore. She will always be a whore, and she'll be destroyed. I showed you last week in Revelation where it talks about her being the mother of harlots. If she's a mother, she's got a bunch of babies. All of those churches that came out of her are her daughters. So you think, well, what churches could that possibly be? What groups could that be? Well, they're usually easy to find. They've got to have a steeple on the top of their buildings. But you have, I think one of the first that came out of the Roman Catholic Church was the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Here in America, it's called the Episcopalians. That church was founded because King Henry VIII, a Catholic, wanted his second divorce. The Pope wouldn't grant it, so he said, okay, well then I'll be Pope. And that's the basis for the Episcopalian Church. That's what it was founded on. Doctrinally, it's Roman Catholic. They follow the same thing. I don't find in my Bible where it's grounds to start a whole new church because the king wants a divorce, but they're out there. That was about the first one. Then we have the Lutheran Church and the Presbyterian Church that came out of Martin Luther and John Calvin, and we've already discussed them. They were Catholic priests. Their issue wasn't doctrine. Their issue was practice. They were upset with the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, the selling of indulgences and some of the other things that the Roman Catholics were doing. That was their problem. It wasn't doctrine, and they carried their doctrine right into the Lutheran Church and right into the Presbyterian Church. Out of the Episcopalians, we have another church that broke out of them by a guy by the name of Wesley, known as the Methodist Church. Now see, all of these churches all claim Rome as the mother church. They all go back to Rome. These are the daughters. When you read about Mystery Babylon, the great mother of harlots, well, these are the babies of that mother. And all of those churches that broke out of there, all of those Protestant churches that all go back to the Roman Catholic Church, those are the harlots. They've never been the true church. They will never be the true church. Now, does that mean that God doesn't have people in them? No, He does. Of course He does. Even towards the end of Revelation, He keeps saying, come out from among them and be ye separate and I'll receive you. Get out of that bunch. If you're in there, get out of that. Of course He has people trapped in that system. That's why that system was set up, to trap God's children in it so they couldn't find the truth. They're there. Not all of the people that go to those churches are God's children, but some of them are. Probably the ones that put the most money in the pot and spend the most time on their knees praying. As Conrad used to say, the ones that are doing the paying and the praying and the paying, those are the ones those are God's children, trapped in that system. They don't know any better. And if you have the opportunity to witness to them, then witness to them. Because every one of us was in that position at one time or another. Every single one of us in this room that are members of this church at one time or another were tied up in some false religion. every single one of us, and somehow somebody cared enough for us or showed enough for us that they were willing to open their mouth and say, you ought to take a look at this. And they weren't afraid that they were going to be laughed at or ridiculed or made fun of. And so they took a stand, and as a result, there's a church here. So think of that when you run into one of these people that seems to be a Christian. You know, the Bible says, by their fruits you shall know them. You find somebody that walks like a duck and talks like a duck, they're probably a duck. You find somebody that truly lives their life like a Christian, and when I say truly, I don't mean just publicly. I mean when you get to know them privately. If they still live their life like a Christian, then too, you might have found somebody that's one of God's children. And they may be trapped in one of these other systems. And at that point in time, it's incumbent upon you to share with them just like somebody shared with you years ago, so that they can possibly come out of it also. And if you know what, if you get ridiculed for it, you get called a heretic, you get labeled a sect, well then be happy for it. So the Baptists are easily found. There's a church that someday I hope to be able to go to. It's called the Hillcliffe Baptist Church. It's in England. It's actually in Wales. Well, no, it's in England, just outside of Wales. It has always been a Baptist church, as far back as anybody has records for it. They rebuilt the building a couple of times over the centuries, but it's always been a Baptist church. And as most old-time Baptist churches, there's a cemetery right next to it. You find an old-time Baptist church, you're going to find a cemetery. And in the cemetery, there are gravestones. And in that cemetery, there is a gravestone. The oldest one that you can actually make out the date is 1357. 1357. Now, there are other gravestones in that cemetery that they have eroded away so far you can't even make out the date on them anymore, which means that they predate 1357 by no telling how much. But the oldest one that you can actually make out a date is 1357, and there's a whole bunch of 1400s and 1500s in there. I want you to think about this. The Protestant Reformation didn't happen until the 1500s. Here we have a Baptist church in England with gravestones that date to the 1300s. Does that not show that the Baptists were here before Calvin, before Luther, before the Protestants, before the Reformation? Of course it does. We've been here since the first century. We've gone under numerous different names. We've been called all kinds of things, mostly bad, but we've been here all along. And the characteristics of a church that only has members that have made a profession in faith and been baptized by immersion and are an independent body, that we find down through history all the way from the first century to today. So you see, the history of the true church is one that a price has been paid for by the persecution that it's suffered down through the ages. We have it easy compared to a lot of these people. It's not to say that we always will, but at least up to this point we have. There was we made mention of this before too, and it's on our website, that the Welsh Baptists of the Midland produced an Articles of Faith in 1655, which was 34 years before the Calvinist profession of faith popped up, the London Confession. And the Welsh Tract Church, which was formed in 1701 in South Wales, ended up immigrating to America. It's located now in Delaware. I actually have a book in my library that was sent to me by a member of that Welsh Tract Church, a book on particular redemption. I wish I could remember where I still had the guy's address. I got it sent it to me years ago. And Conrad has actually preached in that church, in that Welsh Tract Church. The same group that came over from from Wales. Mosham, the Lutheran historian, has this interesting statement, and I'm going to close with this. He said, it may be observed in the first place that the Mennonites are not entirely mistaken when they boast of their descent from the Waldenses, Predobrucians, and other ancient sects, who are usually considered as witnesses of the truth in the times of universal darkness and superstition. Before the rise of Luther and Calvin, there lay concealed in almost all the countries of Europe, particularly in Bohemia, Moravia, Switzerland, and Germany, many persons who adhered tenaciously to the following doctrine, which the Waldenses, the Wycliffites, and the Hussites had maintained, some in a more disguised and other in a more open public manner, vis-a-vis that the kingdom of Christ, or the visible church he had established upon earth, was an assembly of true and real saints, and ought therefore to be inaccessible to the wicked and unrighteous, and also exempt from all those institutions which human prudence suggests to oppose the progress of iniquity or to correct and reform transgressors. The true church has always been here, just like Christ said it would be. You just have to look for it. And when you look for it, lo and behold, you find it. It's been here all along, and you're sitting in it now. So don't take it lightly that millions of your religious ancestors have paid with their life so that you can sit here today. And Lord willing, we'll be able to continue to sit here for years to come without major persecution. Can't promise that. I hope we do. You know, I'd just as soon die an old man sitting in my rocking chair, but if it gets ugly, it's going to get ugly. Okay. So with that, let's stand and be dismissed in prayer as we conclude this study that on the true church of Jesus Christ, which is still here, and you're in it.